Hi, everyone. I am Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and also a political science professor. I am happy to be here to welcome all of you to the Humanities Center for this very special event, the Fall Minerva Lecture. This lecture series was inaugurated a couple of years ago, I think, and its purpose was to bring back to campus retired and emeritus faculty to talk about their work and their continuing reflections on education and the life of the mind. The series was imagined by Dr. Clack, who, when thinking about USD's last lecture series, there is a last lecture series that's advertised everywhere, he wondered why some of our newest faculty were presenting the last lecture. It turns out that the title means the student's last lecture, but it got Dr. Clack thinking about, and he got inspired about doing something like the series that you're attending tonight. The title chosen for the series, the Minerva series, is a reference to Hegel's remark in The Philosophy of Right: the owl of Minerva takes its flight only with the coming of dusk. The lecture series aims to highlight, therefore, the understanding that comes at the end of a university career, not at the beginning, the understanding that can only be the result of decades of experience. The first four lectures, and many of them are out here tonight, which is exciting, in this ongoing series, were Jim Gump. I see you right there. Hi, Jim. From the history department. I don't see Fred Robinson, so Fred Robinson isn't here. From English. Florence Gilman from theology and religious studies. And Marie Simovich from environmental and ocean sciences. So our fifth Minerva lecturer is Dr. Del Dickson. Dr. Dickson taught in the Department of Political Science and International Relations for 34 years. He left us officially in 2022, but he is back in the classroom again this semester to teach one section of Con Law, Civil Rights and Liberties. That's what his teaching is. I hope he comes back again. He keeps telling me he likes his time off. But among other publications, he has written The State Court, Defiance and the Limits of Supreme Court Authority for the Yale Law Journal. He wrote the book, The Supreme Court in Conference, Oxford University Press, which earned the 2002 award for the best book in government and political science by the Association of American Publishers. And he wrote The People's Government on an Introduction to Democracy with Cambridge University Press. And I hear he's up to something else in his retirement. Maybe he'll tell us about it. Dr. Dickson earned his BA at Humboldt State University. He earned his JD at UCLA and his PhD at the University of Southern California. And I don't know if you know about his tradition. During graduation, whoever lost the USC-UCLA game, he would wear the hood of the loser, right? The loser. And then the next, whoever, did you ever have a year where you wore just one hood forever? Yeah, like UCLA's. Yeah. So anyway, he said he's had because I asked him, he's had a very long and painful football season this time around. So he was a deeply beloved professor by students and by faculty, as you can tell by the crowd here, and I know there's a crowd on Zoom as well. And I can attest to the fact that deans miss him, because I miss him very much. But I also want to note, upon his retirement, a group of alumni kicked off a endowed scholarship for current students who might not be able to experience the Washington, D.C. kind of trip and experiential education that's really important to us at USD. And so I know Tanya Batson left her card. If you have an inspirational urge to contribute to a scholarship, nobody's going to turn you down, because it goes to a good cause. Anyway, he's talking about the rule of law, and I will stop speaking now.
Oh, I'm a mockingbird. I'm the opposite of an owl. I'm up at 4 sometimes, but it's almost my bedtime already. Thank you, Noelle, for introducing me, and ladies and gentlemen, the best dean ever. So good job. I want to thank Brian and Lindy for hosting us here tonight. The Humanities Center is just so important to the mission at the University of San Diego, and Brian and Lindy are the ones who make it possible. It is so nice to be back with my friends at my home here at USD. I see my department colleagues who are here. Hello. Faculty, friends, staff, students, my students, some of them. It's just great to be here. I mean, you who know me know not to expect much. You forgive a lot, and that's just perfect for me. And just looking at the top, my notes say be likable. It's good advice from the governor of the future underwater state of Florida. So tonight, the topic is that we need to talk about the rule of law. And why? Like much of what we used to take for granted here in American politics, the rule of law is under stress. And I don't think it's an important topic, and it hasn't been getting the attention that it deserves. So let me see if I can make this work. Ta-da. So, what is the rule of law? And first, I have to go with my first digression. This is a preface. In liberal societies, the rule of law is built on the premise of what is not forbidden is permitted. And I think of this as the presumption of liberty. And kind of like a good breakfast cereal, the presumption of liberty is an essential part of a complete and nutritious rule of law system. There are 4 interlocking parts to the rule of law. I'm going to walk through the first 3, but enforcement, it's a complex topic, and apart from a few asides that I'll give you now and then, I'm happy to leave it for another day and for somebody else, and it will get us out of here an hour ahead of time. In a healthy rule of law society, the rule of law is ingrained in the habits of the people, so that we voluntarily and often unconsciously obey the law, and it makes the system largely self-enforcing. Most people want to follow the law, and they freely do so because, as Max Weber explained, we've internalized its values, and we believe it's in our interest to comply, even if it cuts against us now and then. This can range from voluntarily paying your taxes to surrendering your dog to the local witch if she has the proper legal papers. When there are disagreements or there's bad behavior, there are judges and other government officials standing by, ready to resolve our conflicts peacefully. The rule of law society is not big on self-help. So it means, for one thing, Faye Dunaway does not have to get tough with people. Enforcement, when it's necessary, should be more Sheriff Andy Taylor and less Judge Dredd. And for those of you who don't know, Sheriff Taylor never carried a gun. His idiot deputy, Barney Fife, had a gun, but only one bullet he had to keep in his pocket, so he could never use it. Judge Dredd, on the other hand, loves his guns. The rule of law, liberal rule of society, should be based on nudges and persuasion rather than force. And I know what a lot of you are thinking, and I'm just going to let you draw your own conclusions about America's enduring problem with police violence and our self-destructive obsession with guns. They're related problems, and they are 2 of the most appalling facts of life here. But on a day-to-day basis, we live in a society that relies on voluntary compliance with the law, and this actually minimizes the need for coercive law enforcement. And it also explains why I can drive 80 miles an hour on the freeway and almost always get away with it. So thank God for that. What is the rule of law? This is a reprise. First part is the substantive rule of law. These are the rules that kind of encourage, or they regulate, or they limit, or they prescribe behavior. They generally tell us what's acceptable and unacceptable in our society. And we often think of laws enacting a moral code, but it's not true. Oliver Wendell Holmes observed law and morality are not at all the same thing. Most of our laws, when you think about it, have little or nothing to do with morality. The lines we draw in this system are often based on kind of amoral or expedient factors. It's a democracy. Most of our laws are just negotiated compromises among competing interests, like speed limits. Moreover, most liberal societies accept Locke's rule, the Republican principle, that we're a secular society and there's a strict separation between church and state. The state cannot impose a religious-based moral code on a diverse and non-conforming society. Morality, however, is still relevant. It's relevant because we recognize that we have the right to resist or even defy laws that are illegal, irrational, or immoral. But We have to be ready to go to court and prove our case. And we need to be ready to accept sanctions if it turns out either we were wrong and the law that we thought was bad was actually good, or we were right but society just isn't willing to recognize it yet. It's just a risk that you have to take. This idea was the core of Martin Luther King Jr.'s tactic of peaceful resistance. You have a problem with segregated buses, put someone on the bus, peacefully break the law, take it to court. Thurgood Marshall, first black justice on the court, disagreed with Martin Luther King on this. Thurgood Marshall didn't especially like Martin Luther King. He didn't especially respect Martin Luther King. But again, that's kind of another topic for another day. The difference in their opinion was that Marshall thought even the peaceful law breaking undermined the rule of law. And as a judge and as a justice, he thought that that was not a good idea. Personally, I lean toward Marshall's interpretation and Marshall's position, but I also kind of agree with Burger King, which is no relation, that sometimes you got to break the rules. That was their ad campaign a while ago. But even when you break rules, there are rules to breaking rules. Locke recognizes the right of even violent law breaking, the right of revolution, but he imposed a precondition. If you're a would-be revolutionary, you have to explain yourself and justify yourself to the world before you take up arms. Locke's rules, of course, led directly to the Declaration of Independence, where our founders explained their reasons for separating forcibly from King George III, to which he replied, yeah, you'll be back. Finally, although substantive law is basically morally agnostic, the law still has to kind of broadly reflect contemporary social values, mores, customs. You know, law, again, in a democracy, it's the organic creation of social negotiation. And it has to fit the society in which it lives, or there's going to be trouble, like everybody driving 80 on the freeway. So you just kind of have to take care of that. That's enough for that. Procedural rule of law, to me, this is probably the most important aspect of a rule of law. The second pillar of the rule in law involves kind of authoritative, reasonable, and fair processes for making, interpreting, and enforcing the law. This is the procedural rule of law. It really involves the steps that government has to take when either making or enforcing a law. And it includes some of our most fundamental rights, especially the right of due process. The procedural rule of law is how we make sure that everyone, but especially the state, plays by the rules. Procedural rules must be transparent, they have to be fair, they have to be reasonable. Kind of the shorthand is, if the procedure isn't fair, it isn't due. That's always kind of my shortcut. To be fair, the procedures sometimes have to show special concern for the poor, the weak, and the unpopular. Harlan Fiske Stone called these groups discrete and insular minorities. They're the people who don't really have much political power. They're often ignored or despised by the political process. The example that I think is the easiest is that if you are poor, you have a right to legal representation if you're accused of a crime. I can't think of a minority that's less popular than those accused of serious crimes. God bless defense lawyers, and maybe that's all I'll say about that. They're the ones who make sure that the state follows their own rules. Authoritative interpretation and judgment. Third, people in democratic societies are expected to know their rights. And this is why, Dean Norton, Rights and Liberties course ought to be required at all universities, especially USD. It never will be. And it has nothing to do with my talk, but I want it on the record. And this is the only time I have. Even in a society where people are generally reasonable and law-abiding, disagreements will always take place. The most reasonable people have disagreements with other reasonable people. And when reasonable people disagree on what the law means and push literally comes to shove, like walking past ex-Speaker McCarthy in the halls of the Capitol, we can't just call our own fouls. We need a neutral third party to resolve our conflicts peacefully. This requires an independent judiciary, a judiciary that's insulated from political, economic, and social pressures. It usually involves professional judges or special civil servants with special training, special job protections that protects their job tenure. But in democracies, we often have lay justice as well, either juries or lay judges that come in and complement the professional judiciary. Sharing the burden of judgment by involving ordinary citizens in the process of law, I think, is an essential part of the democratic rule of law system. So I guess now's the time where I say thank you, Fourth Lateran Council and Magna Carta. Next question is, does the rule of law matter? And yeah, it matters a lot. In the final analysis, we have a simple choice. Do we want a system based on law, or do we want a system where justice is the will of the stronger? Because those are your two choices. There really is no third choice. Locke and Madison agree that it doesn't matter who's in charge, whether it's the one, the few, the many. Where the rule of law ends, tyranny begins. Madison warned that in a pure democracy where the majority's will is law, minority rights are always going to be in jeopardy. It's made worse, Madison argued, because a pure democracy, there is no system, or probably few systems, that is so mercurial and so unstable as a form of government. So without effective checks on the will of the majority, the argument was democratic societies will just vibrate between anarchy and tyranny, and this is the kind of oppressive instability. It was exactly what our Constitution was designed to avoid. So the American experiment is based on Madison's and Montesquieu's theory that the only stable, acceptable rule of law form of democracy is a representative republic with a system of checks and balances and separation of powers. This kind of system we sometimes take for granted. It's not easy to build. It's not easy to maintain. Ask, for example, the Chinese. The Chinese government tried to build a rule of law system for 30 years, only to give it up when Xi Jinping just decided, hey, it's much easier to rule as a dictator. Or ask Alexei Navalny about Putin and the Russian legal system, which, by the way, I think is the worst rock band name I've ever heard, Putin and the Russian legal system. They're terrible. But again, I hope you're thinking, well, this can't happen here, can it? Sure, China, Russia, other places. Well, who knows? Americanists and political theorists love to talk about the strength of our institutions and our institutionalized democracy. And during the previous guy's presidency, our institutions were tested and praised for kind of shielding us from the worst excesses of the ex-president's obsessions. And the praise is deserved, I think, at least up to a point. But our institutions really didn't protect us. The institutionalized rule of law is what protected us, and the people in those institutions who believed in the rule of law. The civil servants who insisted on following the rules, even when they were ordered to ignore those rules and just make manifest the president's will. And those same civil servants, by the way, are giving the current president an equally hard time, as they should. The rules are there to follow. Critiques of the rule of law system. Thoughtful critics of the rule of law system, I think it comes in four basic flavors. At least that's all I'm going to talk about. The most comprehensive of these criticisms comes from Marx and Engels. So, why did the Gale family surrender poor Toto to Miss Gulch? Was it because, A, Max Weber will say, the family has internalized the rule of law system, Miss Gulch has the proper papers, it's proper. This is just the way we do things. Or B, did the Gales suffer from false consciousness? Did they think the American legal system was fair when in fact it's rigged? Marx and Lenin argued that Western law, Western rights, Western liberties are all illusions, and the rule of law is just another tool of class oppression. The bourgeois legal system, which is what they call our system, is often unconsciously but systematically used against the interests of the working classes. It's like a game of three-card Monte where if you're kind of a casual observer, it looks okay, but it's rigged. You can't win. Socialist legal systems claim to have the advantage here. And the advantage is they don't have any illusions about the rule of law system. They know that it's an instrument to be wielded not unconsciously, but consciously against all opposition. The second critique borrows very heavily from the Marxist theory, but it substitutes race for class. Originally, this was called Critical Legal Studies, CLS. It was later rebranded as Critical Race Theory, CRT. But the argument stays the same. It's that the American legal system is systematically racist, and it favors white Americans over people of color. The third critique is situational. And this is the transitional regimes will often try to claim the rule of law, but use it as an instrument to justify and solidify its own power. And this is how, for example, a few thousand Normans came over from France, conquered England with very little fuss, just like 5,000 of them, which is a good enough trick in 1066. But then they used the English legal system and were successful within 20 years of transferring 90% of English property from English owners to Norman owners. That's a pretty good trick. You might keep that in mind if you decide to reconquer someplace. For a modern example, take Turkey, please. President Erdogan said it about democracy, but it applies equally to the rule of law. The rule of law is like a streetcar. You take it to where you're going, and then you get off. And Erdogan has been largely successful in his attempts to eliminate judicial independence in Turkey, and this is a clear and present danger to the Turkish rule of law. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying something similar by kneecapping the Israeli Supreme Court and taking away its right of judicial review so he can do what he wants. Again, it's a challenge to the rule of law system. Fourth, and I think this is probably the most persuasive critique of the rule of law, is that law is inherently conservative. It is inherently favoring the status quo, and so it favors those who are advantaged by the status quo. The law emphasizes stability, predictability, and consistency. That's conservative, but people are advantaged by that. All right, here's the rub. Of the four critiques of the rule of law theory, they all have one thing in common, and that is none of them offer an alternative that is practical. The only alternatives to the rule of law system are either anarchy, which is the snotty Sex Pistols kind, not the kind of kinder, gentler Peter Kropotkin kind, or tyranny of the stronger. And at least Marx and Lenin were honest about it. They just had nothing to replace it with except kind of pie-in-the-sky promises. Socialism was an admittedly tyrannical one-party rule, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to be followed, someday, by the vague promise of a utopian society where government and law no longer exist, social conflict disappears, and everybody lives happily ever after. In other words, Star Trek. And again, I'm kidding because the Federation is or will be a liberal society based on the rule of law. Defense of the imperfect rule of law system. I ran across this game. It's a real game. It's on Amazon. This is what happens if you don't have the rule of law. It's probably a terrible game, but I think it makes a great picture. So, with a hat tip to Winston Churchill, the rule of law system is the worst possible form of civil society, except for all the others. And as previously noted, the rule of law promotes certainty, stability, consistency, predictability. Again, classic conservative values that tend to advantage those who benefit by the status quo. But that doesn't end the conversation, because the rule of law is also interested in a second set of values. Among them, rights against the state, fairness, truth, and justice. That second list is aspirational. It's not conservative, it's progressive. They're idealistic values that promote critical reflection and reform. And I think this is the key to understanding kind of the dual nature of the rule of law. The rule of law tries to strike a balance between conservative respect for the wisdom of our ancestors with progressive ideals that encourage us to rethink and improve on what our ancestors either got wrong or they never even anticipated. The law moves with, but more typically, I think, somewhat behind the times. It's what economists would call a lagging indicator. But it's neither dead nor indifferent to the future. It changes, it evolves. Our notions of rights, Fairness, truth, justice, they inevitably change over time as society changes and our needs and our worldview changes. So liberal theory and liberal rule of law theory, they embrace the synthesis of conservatism and progressivism. And the rule of law allows us to do this dance in a more or less orderly way. I just want to highlight one of these four aspirational values. Chief Justice Earl Warren, who is also Dean Norton's favorite, I think. Chief Justice Warren's favorite question for lawyers arguing before the court was as simple as it is profound. He would say, yes, but is it fair? And I don't think that there's a better question for a Supreme Court justice to ask. Because as long as fairness stays as a core value of our legal system and its meaning remains subject to kind of ongoing scrutiny and debate, then the arc of history will bend toward justice. Such a system is going to be imperfect, but it's going to be capable of improvement. It also allows the court to perform its Madisonian role of protecting everyone's rights, especially those who are unable to defend themselves through the normal political process. And face it, if the courts don't protect minority rights, nobody else is going to. The political branches answer directly or indirectly to public opinion. They aren't designed to be fair or especially mindful of minority rights. And they're even less likely to be so without the prospect of judicial review. Threats. Current threats to the rule of law. It's no secret that the American rule of law faces some serious challenges these days. But it's always been true. The rule of law always faces challenges. And we're not at the moment facing an existential threat. But that could change as early as next November. There are current threats. I will focus on just two. In the immediate past and indeterminate future, the most serious threat to the rule of law comes from the Trumpist authoritarian right. Not necessarily from Trump himself, but from that wing. It begins with Trump. Throughout his adult life, Donald Trump has demonstrated his utter contempt for the rule of law. As an aspiring businessman who idolized ruthless men like Ray Cohn, Trump has always viewed the legal system in an instrumental way. It's a cudgel to use against his enemies. It's a tool to amass personal wealth, to foist his debts onto other people, and to evade accountability for his actions. When he became president, these instincts, these behaviors just got worse as he gained power, or as he would call it, gained leverage. President Trump often claimed that Article 2 of the Constitution gave him the right to do anything he wanted to do by whatever means he thought appropriate. My narrator's voice, this is not even close to being true. But it was true in Trump's mind, and again, it's a rule that he lived by. As president, Trump aggressively, though not always effectively, sought to undermine the rule of law by either using or ignoring the law to increase his personal wealth while he was in office. Two, turning the Department of Justice and other departments of government into political tools to go after his political enemies. Third, threatening to defy judges who ruled against him. Fourth, stacking the federal courts with compliant judges, his judges, as he always called them. Fifth, politicizing federal agencies by appointing thoroughly unqualified but very loyal department heads. Sixth, using the presidential power of pardon to make sure that his allies escaped legal consequences of their actions. And finally, seventh, by trying to remove career-protected civil servants who displeased him. Now, Trump explicitly promises to do this all over again if he's reelected. And if that happens, he's likely to be much better at it than he was during his first term. I don't know. How does Attorney General Matt Gaetz sound? And I'm just kidding. No, it's more likely to be Stephen Miller. There is a second related threat to the rule of law that also deserves our attention. Oops. And that is the Trump-Roberts Supreme Court. Now, like most lawyers, my secret dream, and it's not really a secret, it's always been to serve on the Supreme Court. And against all expectations, it looks like that might not happen. But kind of suddenly and definitely surprising, it's okay by me. After 4 decades of kind of daydreaming what my life would be like as a justice, at this point, I honestly would not want to serve on the court if Harlan Crow paid me. Now, the Supreme Court has been around a long time, and it's shot itself in the foot more times than it's had feet. But it's rebounded each time, and eventually it's going to rebound again. But for the foreseeable future, I really find it difficult. Don't listen to me on this, my students. I find it difficult to care what the Roberts Court says about anything. Their decisions still matter, of course. I mean, their decisions, their votes affect everything that we do, all aspects of our life. So I care very much what they do. I just care much less about how they try to justify it. Reading majority opinions of the Supreme Court today is kind of a waste of time, unless you're the Hulk and you're just trying to stay angry, because that's a good way to do it. The majority bloc, with the occasional exception of Chief Justice Roberts, has basically even stopped pretending to respect precedents that they don't like. And they're very quick to make sweeping new pronouncements with little or no legal justification. And I just want to go through very quickly this dual track of bad trends began, like a lot of things, with Antonin Scalia. He was kind of the spiritual harbinger of the current court. Scalia's opinion in the Heller gun rights case, what he did in that case is just extraordinary. He completely erased the actual text of the Second Amendment, and he rewrote it to suit the conservative majority's ideological fantasies about gun rights, completely unhinged from the history of the Second Amendment. And then the court goes and kicks it up a notch, including Citizens United, corporations are people, my friend, and speech is money, both completely unsupported in the law. Holder v. Shelby County, the southern states have learned their lesson and won't go around suppressing voter rights anymore. And Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Center, which demolished 50 years of precedent and invited states that were so inclined to go ahead and compel pregnant women to bear children against their will without any required exceptions. The Roberts Court has turned its back on its constitutional duty to protect these discrete and insular minorities, and it has pivoted to protect the rich and powerful, to promote guns, to promote corporate power, and to weaken the separation between church and state. And adversely, the court has weakened or abolished environmental and consumer laws, workplace rules, affirmative action, women's rights, LGBT rights, and voting rights. The current court is honestly the most troubled court since the Civil War. Its reputation currently is in tatters. Public respect for the court is at an all-time low. And I think I have time, to mention two reasons for this. First, the Roberts Court is waist-deep in an ethical quagmire. It has an internal culture that has allowed outside money and insider self-interest to influence court decisions. That's just flat out, the impolite word is corruption. And second, the majority has adopted a cynical, instrumental, and I think kind of intellectually corrupt notion of original intent. And I want to go through both of those if I can. So, as to the first point, the court's current ethical quagmire. The Supreme Court has always been almost entirely self-regulating and self-policing. It's been that way forever. I see no signs of that changing. None of the regular federal ethics rules that apply to every other judge in the federal judiciary, including recusal rules and the requirement to report bribes, gift reporting, none of that applies to the Supreme Court. They're exempt from it all. Now, as of last Monday, the Supreme Court now has its own official ethical guidelines, but there's no independent policing mechanism. There's no way to enforce it. Each of the 9 justices runs their own independent chambers, and there's really nothing anybody can do about it, including the Chief Justice. So the ethical code is there. Is it enforceable? The short answer is no. Until recently, the justices were, at least for the most part, fairly scrupulous about their off-court behavior. I mean, they know that they're self-policing, and in the past they've always taken pains to be Caesar's wife and kind of above suspicion. Not anymore. They used to avoid, for example, speaking to overtly political and legal activist organizations with regular business before the court. The majority of justices now do this all the time. Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, Alito, Kavanaugh, and Barrett speak to the Federalist Society and other right-wing organizations all the time. The liberal justices do it as well. Sotomayor, Breyer, and before she died, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, regularly talked to left-wing political organizations and legal organizations with business before the court, like the American Constitution Society and the now Legal Defense Fund. For me, the kind of ultimate display of supreme cluelessness was when Amy Barrett spoke at the Mitch McConnell Center at the University of Louisville in 2021. Now, to give just a little bit of context, this was payback to the man who pushed her nomination through the Senate in less than a month and less than a week before the Republicans gave up control of the Senate and the House. With an opening line that I just think ensures her eventual induction into the Irony Hall of Fame whenever it's built. She told the crowd, "My goal today is to convince you that this court is not comprised of a bunch of partisan hacks." And even given the crowd at the McConnell Center, I'm just kind of surprised no one laughed. But maybe they were just polite. I don't know. Notably, though, John Roberts has been much more discreet about this. And Elena Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson have not done it at all. They have stayed away from these kinds of events. All right, so that's enough for that. But as you know, I'm sure, the court now has even bigger problems. Now, again, I need to give a little bit of context. Accepting money and trips and favors from rich outsiders with business before the court, it is now a serious problem. But it's always been kind of bubbling under the surface. Justices have always considered themselves grossly underpaid when compared to private lawyers. They often resent it, and the temptation to make a little extra on the side just sometimes proves too much for justices. There is a current habit of having useful, rich friends with benefits. And again, like a lot of other things, this began with Antonin Scalia. He routinely accepted free trips and other perks sponsored by Republican movers and shakers. And Clarence Thomas learned from the master. I'm going to go a little deeper into his. This is mostly excellent reporting by ProPublica, so I have to give credit where it's due. For several decades, Justice Thomas has enjoyed luxury trips worth millions of dollars on private yachts, private jets, by mostly the conservative billionaire activist Harlan Crow. That's not where it stopped. Crow donated more than $500,000 to his wife Ginny Thomas's PAC, Liberty Central. Liberty Central lobbied against Roe v. Wade and sought to overturn the 2020 election. So $500,000 there. Crow also happened to pay Ginny's salary of $120,000 a year. He paid thousands to the Thomas family in kind of sweetheart real estate deals. He paid $150,000 in tuition for Thomas's ward, Mark Martin. It starts to add up. Now, Justice Thomas claims that Harlan Crow is simply a dear friend, and these are things that friends do for friends. So shut up already. And they are friends. I have no doubt that they're friends, although they only became friends after Thomas became a Supreme Court justice. And Thomas, remember, is not poor. He makes about $1 million a year. But apparently that is not enough, and it apparently still bothers him. Now, Crow is not the only benefactor of Clarence Thomas and family. Before the 2016 election, Leonard Leo, and you might know his name, he was one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society. So this is during the election year, 2016. He had his pollster, who for some reason goes by Kellyanne Conway. Maybe it's a coincidence. He had his pollster, Kellyanne Conway, secretly paid Jenny Thomas $100,000 for which she did no work. He later got asked why he did this, and he said Jenny Thomas was paid as a consultant because she has her finger on the pulse of the people. And he kept the payment secret to protect her privacy. And again, there's no indication of whether he was laughing when he said this. I want pictures. Another Republican influence peddler, Anthony Welter, just forgave, well, he didn't just forgive it, it's just coming out, forgave most or all of his $267,000 loan to Justice Thomas for a luxury RV that Justice Thomas falsely claimed that he had scrimped and saved for years to save up for. But the nice thing is, I'm the silver lining here, we now know a loan forgiveness program the court likes. So there it is. Samuel Alito also apparently has a rich friends with benefits problem. The details are just coming out, so kind of stay tuned with that. Neil Gorsuch sold property to a big law firm with a partner in a big law firm with a lot of business before the court. He didn't bother to report it. Gorsuch and Sonia Sotomayor have both refused to recuse themselves from cases involving their publishers. Sotomayor got $3 million from Penguin. Gorsuch got $655,000 from Random House. You know, you just kind of add all of this up. This is a truckload of bad publicity for the court, and it's completely unwelcome, and it's completely deserved. It's a serious problem, and I think even worse, it's sticky. It's going to be here for a while. Public confidence in the court, it's at an all-time low. It's almost Congress level. 18% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the court, just 18%. 36% have no or hardly any confidence. For a court, these are scary numbers, and they're going to probably go down as new revelations pile up with the coming winter snow, although not here. The Supreme Court's authority, and this is why it's a super problem. The Supreme Court's authority, as we often say, the court has no sword, no purse, no force, no will. All it has is its reputation for integrity, its reputation for fairness. And the appalling behavior that we've seen coming out of the court, it's a direct threat to the court, and it's a direct threat to the rule of law. The second part of the court's problem is the Robert Court's kind of cynical, instrumental use of original intent. Originalism begins with the premise that the Constitution is not a living document. It's, as Justice Scalia liked to say, it's dead. Its meaning was set in stone before the ink dried by someone. But who? The authors? Which ones? The ratifiers? Which ones? The common understanding of the time? Who? And how do you know? What do we know what they were thinking? How do we deal with varying accounts of what they were thinking? Or, more often, the complete absence of reliable historical accounts. How do we account for people who change their minds? I always think of James Madison, who voted for the first House chaplain, thought about it 20 minutes. He said, oh, this is obviously unconstitutional, and he opposed it for the rest of his life. How do you account for that? And the fact of the matter is, it's impossible to predict how the originalist bloc on the court determines originalist intent because there's no methodology to their method. The source of their original intent changes as their needs change. It's like using a Ouija board to determine original intent, except the hand kind of guiding the whole thing. It isn't ghostly, it's corporeal. It's not original, it's contemporary. And it's kind of pulled along by strings attached to the justice's fingers. Again, this is going through and reading Robert's cases. It's why they're so infuriating. They're originalists, but in most of the cases, there's little or no serious historical research, the historians in the room. Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch in particular, they do two things. They cherry pick what they want to help their case, and then they use their kind of original intent Ouija board, trademark, to figure out all the rest. If you've read Alito's opinion in the Dobbs abortion case, his history is absolutely disgraceful. William Brennan called originalism arrogance masquerading as humility, and I think that is about right. Another test. If you've read enough of the court's original intent cases, I guarantee you will be shocked by the number of times that the original sources agree completely with the majority's personal values and preferences. Shocked. But originalism presents a second, completely different problem. And it's that of holding the present hostage to the past. This is something else that originalism does. And this is an idea that the framers and the founders knew was stupid. It's absurd. They knew that you couldn't hold the future to the values of the past. They never intended for it to happen. The Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, the source of most of our rights, you look at them, what do they mean? They give only broad, general guidance. What does due process mean? It doesn't define it. Equal protection, the Constitution doesn't define it. Privileges and immunities, it's not defined. The amendment's authors, the Constitution's authors, didn't define their key terms because they knew they couldn't and shouldn't hold the future to the past. They meant their words to be read broadly and flexibly, to be redefined and updated according to contemporary need and understanding. And if you really want original intent, that's it. But originalism today means the opposite of that. Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization stripped long-established precedents, long-established liberty, privacy, due process rights from women because, the majority said, the framers of the 14th Amendment did not intend for due process or equal protection to include the right to abortion. Of course they didn't. They're absolutely right by that. The authors of the 14th Amendment were all men. They were all well-intentioned men, I assume, but they were men, and they were writing at a time where women were completely excluded from public life. I think it's highly likely that none of them gave a single thought to women or women's rights when they were writing the 14th Amendment. And read narrowly, the 14th Amendment is only about freed slaves. That was their primary concern, but that's not how they wrote the 14th Amendment. They wrote it with its promises of privileges and immunities, due process and equal protection in broad, flexible terms. And here's the magic word again, aspirational terms. The 14th Amendment was never intended to be frozen in time from the moment of ratification or to exclude anyone of claiming their rights under the 14th Amendment. It was written to evolve. But the court majority in Dobbs disagreed, and they stripped women of privacy and autonomy rights without any apologies, and based on a completely self-serving view of original intent. Originalism is not a conservative philosophy, no matter how often Justice Thomas tries to tell you that. It's not a conservative legal philosophy. It's a reactionary legal philosophy, and it's corrosive to the rule of law. The current majority is not interested in preserving precedent. It's not interested in consistency. It's not interested in stability. It's not interested in predictability. They're tearing all of those pages up. Those are the conservative legal values that the current court does not value. They've called into question every civil rights case of the last 70 years, at least if they don't agree with it. And they've signaled their intent to turn, with original intent, turn the constitutional clock back 100 years or more to the original intent of the time. And there aren't many people in this country, I suspect, beyond the current court majority, who think that's a good idea. Quickly, the Supreme Court that the Roberts Court reminds me of, and you tend to go for analogies, you tend to go, this is like, is the Hughes Court, which existed between the Great Depression leading up to World War II. This is during the 1930s and the early 1940s. The court at this time was controlled by four completely reactionary justices who were called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The Four Horsemen were Butler, McReynolds, Sutherland, and Van Devanter. The Four Horsemen were kind of the self-appointed guardians of the rich and powerful, fighting against FDR's New Deal. They defended corporations from any effort to impose regulations in terms of economics, labor, wage, price, antitrust, child labor laws, safety regulations, and they promoted a patently racist version of states' rights. The court of the Four Horsemen, they weren't just indifferent to the rights of discrete and insular minorities. They were openly hostile to those groups. By the mid-1940s, the Four Horsemen were gone, and they were replaced by New Deal justices. And it looked like the Hughes Court's radical and often cruel approach to the law was kind of safely in the nation's rearview mirror. The courts that succeeded Hughes, and Hughes himself was relatively liberal, but four horsemen, Stone, Vinson, Warren courts, they completely refocused the court's energies and turned their attention to these discrete and insular minorities. They focused on minority rights, including desegregation, worker rights, voting rights, privacy rights, the rights of the accused, immigrant rights, free speech rights, separation of church and state, and protections for religious minorities. The following courts, the Berger and the Rehnquist courts, were noticeably more conservative, and they limited some of these precedents, but they extended others, and they created new rights as well, including the right of privacy and gender equality. The early years of the Roberts courts, it was more conservative still, but they still managed to protect and extend some new rights, notably to same-sex marriage. So before 2016, it really looked to me that the Supreme Court had really settled into its Madisonian promise of watching out for minority rights and minority rights being broadly defined. That all changes with the three Trump appointees to the court. The three Trump appointees pushes the majority to 6, and the court very quickly again turned its back on Madison and turned its back on protecting rights, except for the rights of the rich and powerful. The one minority that doesn't need special protection, that's who they protect. And once again, the court began, like the four horsemen, to systematically undermine any federal attempts to regulate business. Economic, labor, environmental, gun laws, rolling back voting rights, rolling back equal protection, due process, privacy guarantees, and blurring the lines between church and state. The Roberts Court is the new court of the four horsemen, only now there are 6 of them. But I don't want to leave on that. For those of us who are really old, when you went to the movies always started with a cartoon. Well, it turns out that the original idea was in the 20s and 30s, you watched the movie and you ended with a cartoon. Because in the days of noir, all the movies were depressing, and they didn't want you to go home depressed, so they showed you a cartoon at the end. This is my cartoon at the end. This is the good news coming in. And the fact is, we live in strange times, and we all know that we live in strange times. And those of us who believe that the arc of history bends toward justice, well, our worldview has been officially challenged. But there's hope. And I would think of law, like my homemade sangria, is stronger than it looks. Between November 2016 and January 6, 2021, we ran a major stress test on our country, on our institutions, and they by and large passed with battle scars, with battle damage. But for the most part, our courts and our federal agencies plugged along using normal rules, normal procedures. There is no deep state in the Trumpian sense. The deep state boogeyman that they keep talking about, it's just our rules-oriented institutions, procedures, and people. Those who resisted government by will, by presidential fiat, and protected us from what I think is the most clear and present danger to the rule of law in the modern era. So, my lesson, God bless the bureaucrats. The federal judiciary is more of a mixed bag, and the Supreme Court is a disaster. It's just a dumpster fire. But to me, the most hopeful sign for the future is Donald Trump's indictment on 91 felony charges. And it's not just that he's been indicted 91 different times, 91 different charges. I have different hopes here. Number one, he submitted peacefully, though not quietly, to legal authorities, rather than kind of locking himself in Mar-a-Lago and telling the cops to come in and get him. So that's number one. He surrendered. Second, there are multiple cases proceeding against Donald Trump, and for the most part, they have all followed regular order. There's a mix of federal judges appointed by Trump, Obama, both Bushes, and Clinton judges writing heard on these cases, plus a handful of state judges, and they've all pretty much gone by the book. So we have entered novel and extraordinary legal territory, and we've done it through completely ordinary legal processes and means. To paraphrase one of my favorite philosophers, Karl Spackler, So we've got that going for us, which is nice. As for the Supreme Court, with its current supermajority, the chances are that nothing's going to get much better in the foreseeable future, just kind of absent unexpected resignations, retirements, or deaths. I mean, it's just the way it goes in an institution that has lifetime tenure. But eventually, this too shall pass. The 4 horsemen finally went the way of all mortals, and the 6 horsemen of the new apocalypse, now that's a band name, the 6 horsemen of the new apocalypse, they're going to eventually exit stage right as well. And so for us, the only question is how much damage do they leave in their wake? I am confident that the Supreme Court will eventually recover, and it once again will become a Madison court dedicated to the principle of equal justice for all, and it will once again kind of assume its historic responsibilities as the supreme guardian of the rule of law. Unless Trump is reelected next year, and then all bets are off. And that's my talk. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's very nice of you. And I didn't shout out to the people who are watching online, although they've probably mostly gone away. But thank you. Thank you for staying away.